Okay, good morning. It's lovely to see you all. Welcome to day 3 of SPHR15, if anyone is tweeting. Thank you for being here bright and early, especially after such a long but very thought-provoking day yesterday. My name is Natalie Hudson, for those of you that I have had a chance to meet, and I'm the director of the Human Rights Studies program here at UD. The Human Rights Studies program, established in 2007, is one of the first undergraduate degree programs in human rights studies in the United States. We have close to 50 majors in our program, and I have the tremendous privilege of working with these students, many of whom were in and out of panels yesterday and will be here again today. These students are some of the brightest and most passionate and hardworking students on campus, and as you heard with the Malawi practicum, for example, yesterday, they are doing some exciting research and advocacy inside and outside of the classroom. This is very much linked with the mission of the center. Involving students, both human rights studies, as well as students from a variety of other majors and disciplines in the research and advocacy work of the center is just one of the aspects of the center that makes it distinctive and cutting edge. I should start with saying that Mark Ensalaco was the first director of this unique degree program, so I have big shoes to fill. And he was largely responsible for its emergence 8 years ago. But it's important to note that Mark's work connecting human rights education, research, and advocacy goes back decades. Mark, along with a number of other UD faculty members, some of them to now a standalone major. But of course, an undergraduate degree program was not enough for Mark. Mark knew as a Catholic and Marianist institution that the University of Dayton can and should do more. Mark had long dreamed of a research center here on campus, focused on practical, applied, and as Cesar reminded us yesterday, I spoke so eloquently, an action-based research that would allow scholars to be and or to partner with practitioners and advocacy organizations. Mark would always say, if we build it, they will come. And you all did. Here you are. Thank you. Mark is truly a visionary. And this conference, this research, this dialogue, and this commitment to advocacy is all part of his vision. And we are glad that you are part of it now, too. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, my friend, and co-conspirator in all things human rights at UD, Dr. Mark Ensalaco.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. That was too kind. Natalie was a student here. And I think she must owe me at incomplete or something like that. Forget those remarks. I'm going to check. And while we're speaking about students, I mean, it's amazing. We always tell our students to sit up front and what's going on, and then we turn around and do it. Okay, well, so welcome to Social Practice Human Rights 15. We're meeting at an important moment, historic moment. As you all know, just last week, the United Nations adopted a 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which sets out an ambitious agenda for transforming our world. That's the title of the document. And of course, Pope Francis, in addresses before Congress and the United Nations, reiterated the appeals in his apostolic letters, Joy of the Gospel, and On Care for Our Common Home, for a global community, for us, the global community, to think about one world with a common plan. I was in Washington and was interviewed shortly after the Pope spoke, and I was asked, would the Pope's remarks before Congress have any influence? And I said I doubted it. And of course, the next day, the Speaker of the House resigned. The Agenda for Sustainable Development is really the focus of our plenaries here today. Our plenaries on sustainable development, environmental sustainability, and corporate sustainability. These are the 3 dimensions of sustainable development: the social, economic, environmental, as transforming our world expresses it, people, prosperity, and planet, because things are more influential if you use alliteration, right? People, prosperity, planet. So you're all invited here to take up the challenge of transforming our world, and that is to think about new approaches and integrated solutions to these immense challenges that are facing us. That's what I hope we'll achieve today. And if today's anything like yesterday, we'll certainly get there. My task is to frame the conversation. And what I'd like to do really is begin by calling attention to the title of the document that was adopted in New York, Transforming Our World. Now remember, just 3 years ago in Rio de Janeiro, the title of the document that came out of there was The World We Want. And that just got me to thinking. So what's the premise behind the title Transforming Our World and the agenda? Is the premise that if the global community achieves the SDGs by 2030, the global community will have fundamentally transformed the world? Or is the premise that in order to achieve even the SDGs, in order to achieve the world we want, the global community must first transform the world? So I want to try to interrogate this question a little bit. And what I thought I would do is take a look back over the history of this. Transforming our world, the world leaders mentioned that these are building on all the commitments and all the documents that have come since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And as an old biblical scholar, I'd really like to take a look back at these things and look at the texts and the commitments that have been made over the years to try to get at this question. Is simply adopting ameliorative responses to these urgent crises, is that enough, or do we have to transform our world? And you're going to see time and time again at each critical juncture in the evolution of our thinking and what becomes this integration of the human rights, the development, and environmental agendas. At each stage in this evolution calls one out for radical change. So I'd like to try to look at that very much in the spirit of what at our last conference, Juan Mendez did, or Alex DeWall, by taking this long historical view. Now, I know what you're thinking. I can just hear it. I'm going to try to fill Juan Mendez's shoes. I can just hear you thinking, sir, I know Juan Mendez. Juan Mendez is a friend of mine. You, sir, are no Juan Mendez. And I confess, but this spirit of looking at historical things is very important. And just to set it up, I mean, if you look back to the Universal Declaration of Rights, you see that there was an intrinsic connection between the enjoyment of human rights and development from the very beginning, and that's captured in the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says the aim of the UN is to promote social progress and better standards of living, better standards of life, and larger freedom. But it's also evident that from the very beginning there is a connection between the enjoyment of human rights and the global order. And so Article 28 of the Universal Declaration of Rights proclaims an entitlement to a social international order in which all the rights set forth in the Declaration can be fully realized. So I want to get at this connection between development, human rights, and now the environment, because that's part of the equation. And what I'm going to say is that the imperative to transform the world, the structures, to get at questions of inequity and injustice have always been at the core of the human rights idea. Now, certainly the leaders who met in San Francisco and Bretton Woods firmly believed that they had established international order which conducive to human rights. But the record shows that time and time again calls have gone up for transformation of our structures and our institutions. Of course, there have been profound changes in the global order over the years, but those have really been driven by geopolitics and geoeconomics, not necessarily a common concern for social progress, better standards of life, and larger freedom. So let me see if I can get at that, if you will. Start, of course, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights does not use the term development, much less sustainable development in the sense we use it now, or in the sense of the 1986 Declaration on the Right to Development, as a comprehensive economic, social, and cultural progress. But it does allude to the importance of what we now call economic development and official development assistance, or ODA. Now, development in the Universal Declaration of Rights means integral human development, the free and full development of the human personality. That phrase appears 3 times. Rights are necessary if they're free and full development of the human personality. And my own view, to jump into the foundational arguments that were so lively yesterday, is that this is really the core idea, that this is really the Human Rights Declaration, a very personalist-centered thing. The goal of human rights, not only to free people from all sorts of oppression, but to enable the development of the free and full development of the human personality. And in the penultimate draft in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it talked about the human person, body, mind, and spirit. Spirit came out of there in the final draft, but it gets at religious questions, which I'll explore a little bit, because in these remarks, when I mention the various commitments and documents over time, I'm going to allude to some papal encyclicals too, because the church was engaged in this conversation from the beginning. So development in the Declaration means integral human development. But one of the articles, Article 22, defines the entitlement to the realization of economic, social, cultural rights indispensable for dignity and the free and full development of the human personality through national effort, development, and international cooperation in accordance with the resources of each state. So the United Nations recognized the intrinsic connection between the realization of human rights and development from the very beginning, and it recognized that for there to be economic development, wealthy nations would have to provide development assistance. And of course, even before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UN established a subcommission on economic development in 1948 to advise the Economic and Social Council and enlisted experts to study the challenges of promoting economic development in underdeveloped countries. That was the word they used initially, underdeveloped countries, not developing countries. The earliest studies in the 40s and 50s were bleak. The international economic and financial institutions, it was found, were not amenable to making massive investments necessary for development. The World Bank even opposed the creation of a special fund for development in the third world. Little or no private investment flowed into the developing world. And free trade policies put developing countries at a disadvantage, and the long-term deterioration of trades for commodities, the lifeblood of developing countries, doomed these countries to dependency. That was the analysis then. So in the 1960s, at the urging of President Kennedy, the United Nations declared the first development decade and proposed an action plan called Growth Plus Change. And there was the hope that developed countries would offer more favorable terms to stabilize commodity prices, and that increased international development assistance would flow to the developing world. And of course, the UN established the UNDP in 1965. Now, I suppose the slogan Growth Plus Change was, the premise of this was that economic growth would bring about change, and that change would be tantamount to the social progress and better standards of life and greater freedom envisioned in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But it didn't work out that way, and in fact, the UN at this time did not make an explicit connection between development and human rights. It was only implicit. But that connection between human rights and development came in 1966, 20 years after the Declaration. It came with the adoption of the Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. The Covenant made this connection between economic and development and human rights more directly than the Declaration. The Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is a core human rights convention, but in many ways, for all intents and purposes, it lays out a development program. You look at some of those articles, it talks about some, maybe all of the SDGs we're talking about. It obligates states to implement programs in the area of food production, distribution, development of agrarian systems, infant mortality, child development, education, prevention of epidemic and endemic diseases, and on and on. This is a development agenda. And in an early hint of the importance of the environment to the realization of human rights, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights obligates states to improve all aspects of environmental and industrial hygiene. So this idea of the environment was right there. Now, the Covenant also fleshes out the ideas of the Universal Declaration, which mentions the imperative of national effort to promote development and international cooperation. The idea is that steps must take to the maximum available resources to achieve progressively the full realization of economic, social, and cultural rights. States must do this individually and through international cooperation, especially economic and technical. So there's this idea that development means development aid. What was to come into view here was this appeal to equity, equality, fairness, and justice. I mean, this is fundamentally a moral appeal that goes beyond the enumerated rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. International assistance and cooperation, technical and economic assistance, developing countries or underdeveloping countries have a moral claim to these. And why? Because everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which all the rights and freedoms in the Declaration can be realized. But there's really an indictment here. I mean, by making this claim, it's simply saying the prevailing economic institutional order is not that kind of order in which rights can be realized. This is the sentiment, the sense of injustice, the complaint, the quarrel that's behind the Covenant articulation of the right to self-determination, which reads, all peoples have a right to self-determination, and by virtue of this right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Before there's a right to development, there's a right to self-determination, but they're integrally connected. What is self-determination? It's the right to freely pursue your economic development. But it's coming out of a grievance. But here we have the predicate for the right to development to be articulated 20 years later. All peoples, for their own ends, freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources without prejudice to any obligations arising out of international economic cooperation, based on the principle of mutual benefit in international law. In no case may a people be deprived of its own subsistence. I mean, that is a pretty dramatic thing in 1966. You can't starve us to death. This reads more like an indictment of the international order, because in declaring these rights, a right to self-determination, the covenant is actually decrying systematic patterns of injustice in the international system. I mean, the idea here is that developing nations are not free to pursue their own economic development or dispose of their wealth and natural resources. There's too much foreign control for that. Without any prejudice to obligations arising out of international cooperation, those obligations are too often prejudicial to developing countries. The principles of mutual benefit, international law, the idea here is that commercial law, trade agreements, the whole legal system governing the international economic order, these are crafted not to ensure mutual benefit, but the benefit of the wealthiest. That was 1966. A year later, Pope Paul VI gives an encyclical called On the Progress of Peoples. And in it, Pope Paul VI called attention to structural injustices that impede development. This was, again, his encyclical. This is what he says: the progressive development of peoples is an object of deep interest and concern for the Catholic Church. That interest is why we have a human rights program, right, as a Catholic institution. This is particularly true in the cases of those peoples who are trying to escape from ravages and hunger, poverty, endemic diseases, and ignorance, those who are seeking a larger share in the benefits of civilization, globalization. It's the same story over and again. It's only too clear, he wrote, that existing international institutions, often the legacy of colonialism, are no match for the harsh economic realities of today. That unless the existing machinery is modified, the disparity between rich and poor countries will increase rather than diminish. And so for Pope Paul VI, in order to fight poverty, it was necessary first to oppose the unfair conditions of the present and agree upon a common plan to achieve a more perfect form of justice among men. This is 1967. 4 years later, in 1971, in another apostolic letter, Pope Paul VI denounced flagrant injustices which exist in the economic, cultural, and political developments of nations that leave many people to struggle against starvation while some enjoy prosperity. I was going to title this speech after the late, great Yogi Berra, "This is deja vu all over again." We're going to hear this over and over again, including today. So he decries these flagrant inequalities that leave many people to struggle against starvation while the rest of us enjoy prosperity. And in a prescient fashion, the Pope called attention to environmental degradation and introduced the notion of sustainability. Man is suddenly becoming aware that by an ill-considered exploitation of nature, he risks destroying it and becoming in turn the victim of this degradation. Not only is the material environment becoming a permanent menace, pollution and refuge, new illnesses, and the absolute destructive capacity of man, but the human framework is no longer under man's control, thus creating an environment for tomorrow which may well be intolerable. An intolerable, that is to say, unsustainable future. For those who think that Pope Francis is some radical and just, this is coming out in 1971. We're building on that tradition. And so now when we think about fairness in the international economic order, environment is part of the equation, is part of the discussion. These are the early years of the environmental movement, and this is the setting in 1972 for the UN Conference on Human Development in Stockholm. And here we really have the first statement of the connection between human rights and the environment. The 1972 Declaration of the UN Conference on Human Environment says this in the very first paragraph. The very first paragraph makes the connection between human rights and the environment. Right? Man has the fundamental right to freedom, equality, and adequate conditions of life in an environment of equality that permits a life of dignity and well-being, and he bears a solemn responsibility to protect and improve the environment for future generations. So we have the connection between enumerated rights in the Declaration and the environment, and we get the beginning of this notion of intergenerational rights and this notion of sustainability for the future, preserving things for the future. The Declaration repeatedly connects the environment to development and calls attention to the vulnerability of developing countries. The protection of the environment, it says, is a major issue which affects the well-beings of peoples and economic development throughout the world. And the Stockholm Declaration connects the environment to problems of underdevelopment and calls on developed countries to reduce the gap between themselves and developing countries. Although it's really interesting in the Stockholm Declaration, it almost blames environmental degradation on underdevelopment rather than on the policies of developing countries. But then the Declaration says this, the just struggles of the peoples of all countries against pollution, the just struggles of all people against pollution should be supported. This is this notion of solidarity. And so resources should be made available to preserve the environment, taking into account the circumstances of developing countries and any cost that may emanate from their incorporating environmental safeguards into their development planning. This is the beginning of this notion of differentiated responsibilities that is so contentious, at least in the US government. Of course, to be able to do this, all this demands additional resources and technical and financial assistance, but all of this in the Declaration and everything to follow falls on governments and international institutions. There is not a word in the Stockholm Declaration about the private sector. In fact, do a content analysis of all these documents and find the private sector or corporations. It just doesn't appear. When it appears, it'll appear with a vengeance. There's not a word about the private sector, not a word. Nothing about companies dumping toxic substances into the soil, the air, and the water. Nothing about corporations incorporating environmental safeguards into their policies. Nothing about corporations bearing any of the cost of preserving the environment. This is 1972. I'm from Buffalo, New York, Tonawanda, New York, Niagara Falls. We're discovering Love Canal. All right? 80,000, 40,000 people evacuated for homes because of this toxic dumping. Not a word about it. The notion of regulating the activities of multinational corporations in the interest of advancing human rights, promoting development, and protecting the environment, much less this notion of corporate responsibility. This was just beginning to dawn on the imagination of the international community. But if the global community is to take seriously the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, assertion of a right to a social and international order in which all the rights in the Convention, in the Declaration can be realized, then the private sector has to be brought into the conversation. After all, corporations, especially multinational corporations, though non-state actors, were and are immensely powerful ones. And the international order, by and large, is favorable to their interest, was favorable to their interest. This was the view. And so in the political and intellectual milieu of the mid-1970s, the power of corporations was the problem. Right? This was the era of critical theory, dependency theory, remember how to read all that? And yes, liberation theology, one of which is making a comeback. And so when the question of international, multinational corporations was finally raised, it was raised with a vengeance. Remember the Declaration on the Establishment of the New International Economic Order in 1974? What a document that was. Now, Pope Paul VI, years earlier, had spoke about the machinery of the international order, the need to change the machinery of the international order. But the Declaration on the Establishment of the New International Economic Order discussed the machinery right down to its inner workings, its sockets and gears. Everything is in this thing. It's an indictment. It talks about food and commodity prices. I'm being corrected by someone about this. It talks about food and commodity products, shipping rates, insurance. I mean, everything is in this. It talks about the international monetary system. It's an indictment. But of all the many ills of the dominant international economic order, the power of multinational corporations in this declaration was the most serious. So the declaration demanded that all efforts should be made to formulate, adopt, and implement an international code of conduct for transnational corporations to prevent them from interfering in the internal affairs of countries in collaboration with racist and colonial regimes. I mean, can you imagine writing that today? So it was imperative to regulate multinational corporate activities in host countries to eliminate restrictive business practices and to make them conform to the national development plans and objectives of developing countries, I'm quoting, and to ensure the repatriation of profits accruing from their activities and so on and so on. I mean, you know, there's merit in thinking about an international code of conduct for international corporations, but the Declaration on the NIEO reads more like a manifesto for third world liberation than the UN Declaration. I mean, it's implacably hostile to the very idea of free enterprise and free markets. But think about the context. I mean, the demand for a new international economic order had been gathering from some time in the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. It's calling for a new international economic order, and you know what? One is starting to evolve. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development met in Santiago, Chile in 1972 during the beleaguered presidency of Salvador Allende, who just appeared before the UN decrying this injustice in the global international order. The military removed them on September 11th the next year, in 1973. And by the time the UN adopted the Declaration on the New International Economic Order, Chilean disciples of Milton Friedman were already beginning to create the new international economic order. It just wasn't the one envisioned in the Declaration on a new international order. A final comment about the Declaration, a critical one. It sought to insulate, I believe it sought to insulate the third world regimes from human rights accountability. For example, it demands the extension of active economic assistance without any political conditions whatsoever. I mean, this is an abuse of the notion of right to self-determination. We can do any damn thing we want, have any type of regime in its self-determination. Pope John Paul II would call this out. It brings me to Pope John Paul II's encyclical on social concern, 1985, in a very different era. Ironically, again, as the UN was declaring the urgency of establishing a new international economic order, and by the time the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights finally entered into force in 1977, a new international economic order was beginning to take shape. Right? Private banks, which are multinational enterprises, flush with petrodollars, began lending to developed countries in exorbitant amounts. Private financial institutions were displacing the World Bank as the source of investment, and for many countries that meant, many of them governed by authoritarian regimes, this meant economic boom. But that boom soon turned to bust. The onset of the global debt crisis in 1982, more than any UN document or plan of action, truly transformed the global economy. The 1980s, the lost decade of economic growth for much of the world, was an era of structural adjustment policies that compelled governments to reform their economic systems along neoliberal lines. And whatever the benefits of structural adjustment over the long term and the short term, this severely affected livelihoods and lives. I remember as a young graduate student being in San Jose, Costa Rica, when the IMF came in. An IMF team came into Costa Rica, the most stable democracy in Latin America. And I remember seeing spray paint on the Costa Rican Congress, and it just simply said, "Aquí, señor Fondo gobierna." Here, Mr. Fund governs. And it was true. So whatever the benefits of structural adjustment over the long term and the short term, the impact was devastating. And so, not surprisingly, in quick succession, the Pope gave an encyclical on social concern, and the United Nations adopted the Declaration on the Right to Development. John Paul's encyclical on social concern began with a lament that in the years since Pope Paul VI encyclical on the progress of people, nearly 20 years earlier, quote, "The hopes of development at that time so lively appear very far from realization." Sure, the United Nations had declared the 60s and the 70s to be development decades, but despite some positive achievement, an innumerable multitude of people are suffering. He took note of the widening frontiers of wealth and poverty and observed that developed nations have not felt the duty to help. The lavish lending and borrowing over the previous decade, though intended for the development of peoples, had actually aggravated underdevelopment, he used that term, and burdened the third world with an unsustainable debt. There were problems in the international system, but Pope John Paul II also directed criticism at third world regimes with abusive human rights record, who he said that these regimes, in the name of equality, had denied basic human rights and political freedoms, including the right to organize trade unions and the right to economic initiative, private property. He was, of course, thinking of the communist regime in his native Poland, but the criticism was far more far-reaching. And this was an important critique. The UN had generally neglected questions about governance and human rights performance in developing countries and simply gave them a free ride. In fact, the articulation of right to self-determination had provided regimes the pretext to deflect criticism of their actions and inactions in a way that conflicted with the Universal Declaration's repeated references to a democratic society. And this was fully apparent in the language of the new international economic order, but that's going to change. So it brings us to the right to development, 1986. At the height of the debt crisis, the United Nations adopted the Declaration on the Right to Development. The Declaration has given us the authoritative definition of development that has framed the global conversation ever since its adoption. It says development is a comprehensive economic, social, and cultural process. Development aims at the constant improvement and well-being of the entire population and of all individuals, and the fair distribution of benefits resulting therefrom. Those who study Catholic social teaching know this is the principle of the common good. The human person is the central subject of development and is the main participant and beneficiary of development. Those who work in Catholic social teaching know this is the personalist principle. Right? Development is an inalienable right, declares the Declaration. And the Declaration makes the now by familiar appeals for an equitable global order and meaningful international cooperation. It calls for the creation of national and international conditions favorable to the right to development, echoing the Universal Declaration's entitlement to a social international order in which all the rights can be realized, same thing all over again. And it speaks about the duty of states to cooperate in removing obstacles to development, which in the 1980s meant the debt, and to undertake sustained action to promote more rapid economic development. I mean, it's the same story over and again. It acknowledges, however, as Pope John Paul II had noted, that the denial of civil and political rights in developing countries also was a serious obstacle to development. Now, the Declaration on the Right to Development is just that, it's a declaration. The United Nations never adopted a legally binding convention to give it force, but it is nonetheless authoritative. The World Conference on Human Rights in 1991 reaffirmed its fundamental assertion that the right to development is an inalienable right. The Millennium Declaration, and now Transforming Our World, invoke its authority. So here we are. So as the global community approached the 50th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration, the UN had adopted a series of authoritative texts containing what is essentially a human rights creed. I'm sorry, this is the old biblical scholar in me. You look at these texts as quasi-canonical, right? And you look in them for formulations from statements that we've adopted ever since. We have a creed here, the beginning of a creed. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, Article 1 of the Universal Declaration. Everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which all the rights in the Declaration can be fully realized, Article 28 of the Universal Declaration. Development is essential to the enjoyment of rights. Self-determination is essential to development. Development is a right. There's the creed, right? But the notion here is that without recognition about the importance of development, the right to development, self-determination, without recognition of these rights, the UN pledge to promote social progress and better standard of living and larger freedom is void of any practical meaning. And so now really the once separate human rights, development, and now environmental agendas are on the verge of full integration, and this was accomplished with the concept of the sustainable development. The credit for that goes to the World Commission on Environment and Development, the Brundtland Commission, which was established in 1983, and which in 1987 produced an incredible report called Our Common Future. And if you read that, you've just read Transforming Our World. I mean, this agenda was set long before the Millennium Declaration. The concise definition in the Brundtland Report of Sustainable Development informs the conversations we've been having ever since. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future to meet its own needs. Simple as that. But needs is the key here. Very next line says the concept of needs or basic human needs is at the core of sustainability, mean first and foremost the essential needs of the poor, I'm quoting, the essential needs of the poor to which overriding priority should be given. This is a secular version of the Catholic tenet of the preferential option of the poor. You want to talk about sustainability, you talk about the needs of the poor. That's the conversation we're having. And it leads us to talk about inequality as well. So the goals of economic and social development must be defined in terms of sustainability in all countries. And the task of the global community must be to agree upon a broad strategic framework for achieving sustainable development. I mean, this comes more than a decade before the Millennium Declaration, right? And the report delivers the familiar message about the vast inequalities of the global order and the effect on poverty. The essential needs, it says, of vast numbers of people in developing countries for food, clothing, shelter, jobs are not being met. And beyond their basic needs, these people have legitimate aspirations for an improved quality of life. A world in which poverty and inequity are endemic will always be prone to ecological as well as other crises. Right? So now the ecological dimension is now prominent in our discussions. All of this, the report says, calls for an honest assessment of the rules governing globalization. Quote, international economic relationships pose a particular problem for environmental management in many developing countries. The production base of the developing world suffers similarly from both local failures and the workings of the international system. And then the report in 1987 makes this trenchant analysis. Two conditions must be satisfied before international economic exchanges can be beneficial for all. Right. The sustainability of economic systems on which the global economy depends must be guaranteed, and the economic partners must be satisfied that the basis of the exchange is equitable. Relationships that are unequal and based on dominance of one kind or another are not a sound and durable basis for independence. For many developing countries, neither condition is being met. Deja vu all over again. So we're in the 1990s, and I won't go through all the documents, but by the 1990s, all the documents of the major conferences which are referenced in Transforming Our World affirm all these propositions. The 1990 Declaration and Plan of Action of the World Summit on Children, the 1992 Rio Declaration adopted at UNCED, or the Earth Summit, and the UN Framework Climate Convention also adopted that year, the 1993 Declaration and Program of Action of the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, the 1995 Declaration and Program of Action on Social Development. All of these, almost verbatim, stress sustainability and pick up the language of the previous documents. All of these conferences were agenda-setting and action-oriented, but in some ways, in my view, the World Summit on Children was the most important because in many ways it was the precursor to the Millennium Declaration. Only it focuses on the protection, survival, and development of children, not the entire human community. But essentially, the program of action that came out of the World Conference and the Summit for Children is a plan of action that, for all intents and purposes, is the development agenda that foreshadowed the Millennium Development Goals, adopted exactly 10 years earlier. It talks about reduction of poverty, infant mortality, and so on and so on. In other words, the kind of development-like obligations that we now find in the MDGs and the SDGs. And importantly, the plan of action that came out of the Summit for Children addressed the adverse effects on environmental degradation. So now the environment is fully in the conversation. Children have the greatest stake in the preservation of the environment, the plan of action says, and its judicious management for the sustainable development as their survival and development depends on this. And in this regard, it says it's critical to break the vicious cycle between poverty and environmental degradation. This is exactly the message of the Stockholm Declaration in 1972, same things. Now, I single out the Declaration and Plan of Action of the World Summit for Children because of the lessons we can glean from the global community's achievements and failures here. In 2001, here, we convened a conference to assess the progress made in achieving the Plan of Action achievements 10 years after the Summit on World for Children. The Secretary General had just published a report, a 10-year report on these developments, and his observations were bleak. He noted 10 years after the adoption of the Plan of Action for Children, there had been real and significant progress in many areas, but also setbacks and real retrogression, some serious enough to threaten earlier gains. And he noted again the widening disparities between wealthy nations and poor nations, despite the peace dividend we all expected to come from the end of the Cold War. And then this, in a time of unprecedented global prosperity and in a $30 trillion global economy, half of humanity is desperately impoverished, with 3 billion people subsisting on $2 a day or less. Of these 1.2 billion souls, he uses that word, of these 1.2 billion souls live in what the World Bank categorizes as absolute poverty, stripped of all human dignity as they struggle to survive on $1 a day or less in conditions of almost unimaginable suffering and want. Half of them are children. What's changed? I don't know that number's changed all that much, right? But he said that this is not because the goals were too ambitious or technically beyond reach. It was because of insufficient investment in children, lack of political will. Never before had official development assistance had fallen so low. We all know about the Millennium Declaration and the new agenda transforming our world. They say the same things. Our challenge, said the Millennium Declaration, is to ensure that globalization becomes a positive force for everyone because resources are so unevenly distributed. Transforming Our World, adopted just days ago, says the very same thing. There are immense challenges to sustainable development. Billions of our people to continue to live in poverty and are denied a life of dignity. There are rising inequalities within and among our countries. There are enormous disparities of opportunity, wealth, and power. So I repeat the question. What's the agenda? What What is the premise? Do we believe that by achieving the SDGs by 2030, we will have transformed the world? Or are we to think that even to achieve the SDGs, we must transform the world first? I think that's the message in the historical overview. So I'm looking forward to these plenaries as we think about new approaches and integrated solutions. And I simply want to say this, and in another address I would have talked about it. I think the key is corporate social responsibility. We have a global and international economic order that is very conducive to private sector, and maybe that is it should be. And thinking back this call for an international code of conduct, one's needed. Was it what was demanded in a new international economic order, right? This sort of this plan that was very hostile and inimical to private investment. We're not going to get that. The other question that we ask is, are we comfortable with the United Nations Global Compact, where we expect corporations to voluntarily do the things that have been repeatedly called for, to invest for mutual benefit, to stabilize prices, right? I mean, these are one of the immense challenges because it's the frontier that's never been discussed in the whole evolution of these documents. We've never fully incorporated the private sector into the discussion in the way we brought other non-state actors like terrorist organizations and guerrillas into this, not to make the moral equivalence. Right? But I think that's the challenge. So this is my brief history of this. As I read this, I can just simply see that the message of transforming our world, the challenge of transforming our world, has just been repeated decade after decade after decade, which leads to the question, what makes us think things are going to be different this time? Unless we ask a different question. What must we do to ensure that this time things are different? So thank you. I sat down without asking if there's any questions. I guess I was afraid of questions. So thank you. That concludes our summary.
We'll take a couple of questions before we break out for the...
yeah. How much time do we have, Yusuf? Just a few minutes, right? Good.
Thank you for your history. And I'm wondering, when were women ever brought into the discussions as separate entities? And I'm sure a number of people are thinking along those lines, so I need not flesh this out. I'll just hand it over to you. But again, in terms of family planning, we all know the controversies involved in terms of women's health issues writ large, the special needs that might be associated with women. Thank you.
So Natalie Hudson's the expert on this one, but I could have cited these, or what a long presentation would have been much longer. And you already have the conferences. In 1975, you've got a declaration in Mexico City on women and development and peace, making that connection. The Pope's encyclical in 67 on the progress of people, it said development is a new name for peace. The first summit on women in Mexico City, I think it's the first, I'm going to be corrected, basically makes this thing. I didn't incorporate these into these remarks because I was trying to show the connection between development, human rights, and all that. But no, the discussion on women has been powerful all along.
Question here.
Eugene. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, on May 18th of this year, my alma mater and his, the Sun Microsystems president, came to the engineering campus at University of Wisconsin-Madison. He showed that the cost curve has gone down so much that the two cheapest energy systems now are wind power and solar. The fossil fuels have been eclipsed. They are all more expensive. Coal, oil, and natural gas. The solar age has arrived. 5 years from now, we'll have the batteries to store it overnight. So we'll have a complete system in about 5 years. So that will transform the world.
Yeah. I hope that's true. We're out of time.
We are. Question.
So Dr. Ensalaco, you mentioned a lot about multinational corporations dealing with human rights, and obviously we have people like the Melinda Gates Foundation who obviously support sustainable development and all this other stuff. But again, we also have multinational corporations who degrade human rights in like stuff like the sweatshops and all this other stuff, which is a huge thing of development. And I was wondering, because NGOs, obviously, they have somewhat of an influence with the UN. Do you think at any point in the future that multinational corporations might have something to deal with the UN, or maybe even possibly in the near future have a seat maybe in the United Nations?
No, I don't know. I mean, they don't need a seat. I mean, they don't need a seat. I mean, and they were involved. They were involved in the development and all this. And you know, we have this plenary on corporate social responsibility. I'm looking forward to this because we've got people here who sue corporations and people who collaborate with corporations. I mean, we're working on a major project, the Human Rights Center, on sustainable supply chains. They're looking at slave labor coming out of Latin America, particularly Brazil, and U.S. supply chains. And the whole idea is that our premise is that if we provide evidence to corporations, to CEOs, that they're inadvertently sourcing from blacklisted companies, and that we provide them with evidence that their monitoring is not sufficient, that they'll make the necessary changes. In other words, we're assuming goodwill. I'm not sure we're assuming goodwill as so much as we're just assuming that they can out-lawyer us. You know, and so confronting them head on is just running over a cliff. But yeah, I mean, they got tremendous influence. They can be a tremendous force for good. You know, we have the UN Guiding Principles on Business Human Rights, founded in this sort of protect, respect, and remedy framework that John Ruggie, as a special representative on business human rights, put out. I'm not sure that's rigorous enough, and I would think that it's time to start thinking about a human rights convention that will more rigorously regulate I mean, we simply can't have a system in which governments negotiate bilateral, multilateral trade agreements in a world in which you supposedly protect human rights, and have those trade agreements specifically exempt multinational corporations from the obligation to obey the laws in the countries they are. That's just counterintuitive. Well, it's not counterintuitive. It's the way the world works, and it makes perfect sense from that point of view. But we need to address that deficiency. So I think that's the next big frontier. And I think with that's the way to go into plenaries. Let's do this. I just wanted to give you the background. Now we need to do the heavy lifting, and I'm just going to sit and listen. Thank you.